This session is about Simpson, Europe, and the Middle East. We've been walking through the life of A.B. Simpson, been diving into the fourfold gospel and connecting with our theology, thinking about abiding in him, um, and some specific things about missions and being a church or a movement, and how can we be together, both of them. And today I want to start in Simpson, Europe and the Middle East, and the subtitle is actually to see him view his world and connect in such a way that he sees gospel access in it. And it was a challenging time when Simpson went to Europe, and it was a leave of absence which paved the way. In 1871, he visited Europe and he had a mental and physical breakdown because of his high work ethic. The church he served decided to send him on a doctor's leave, such as a prolonged vacation, to visit the old continent, the old world. And there were no planes at the time, so he had to use the boat. And it took some time to get there. But once he arrived in Europe, he went on his way. To recover from his overwork, and to be inspired, he chose to visit Europe. And he went to England at first and was just a steamliner connecting the US and the harbor of New York with the continent. From there, he crossed the English Channel and went to Belgium. And there are lots of nice stories of him being on a boat in the English Channel in the biography by Dave Jones, where he sees a lot of people getting seasick, and he writes really vividly to his wife Maggie in the US. He visited France, Switzerland, and Italy, and he went back through Germany, Belgium, and England. And he took the lessons he learned at heart, and this is what we are going to look at in this session. Let's go to 1871. I don't know if in what ways you are connected to history. For me, it's something I like a hobby. So I like to dive in history and like to connect the dots with theology and other enterprises. It's just something I like. And it gives a lot, because if you can connect the dots, you can understand where some kind of thinking comes from. And it's the same with Simpson. His historical setting of 1871 had a lot of implications, and one of the things was that the industrial revolution came to be, and the world changed on a rapid scale never seen before. Empires grew and profited from new inventions, many of which resulted in rapid changing balance of power. Germany became an empire and a major player on the world's developing scheme. The new world was also on the rise, and empires of old were in a race to develop as quickly as they could. There was a race for raw materials, an imperialist expansion, and several wars to influence the balance of power. Maps were drawn anew all the time. We'll have a look at that in just a moment. On the social side, workers united, and Marx's Communist Manifesto inspired the workers in their dire situation to mobilize and take up arms if necessary. There was a struggle for equal and better rights for workers, women, who couldn't even vote at the time. Charles Darwin's Origins of Species gave the world a different view on creation, faith, and much more. And this all in this time. I have some photos to share. This is the German Reich, when it first became a German Reich. Before that, Germany was like, as you can see on the map, all kinds of small countries connected with each other just by language, but no country as we know it today. And in 1870, there was the Franco-Prussian War, which actually was started by France because they were a little afraid of Germany as a rising power, especially industrial power, and a rising empire. And It made sure that the Germans connected in the French and Prussian War. And within 6 months, the war was won and the maps were drawn anew. This is Europe in 1870. As you might see, the provinces of Lorraine and Alsace were added to the German Empire. And it was really a big loss for France. But there were many other things, as you can see, if you look at the map and think of the map of today, it's totally different. Belgium was smaller, for one thing. Austria-Hungary was a big empire. You had the Ottoman Empire, you had the Russian Empire, all empires. And all these empires had very much expansion into the world. But there was also, because of the Industrial Revolution, there were factories coming and people were on the move, moving from the countryside to the cities to get to work. And the people who had power at that moment, the people who owned the factories, paid very little, and people had to work long hours. And Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. And this is 1871 Paris, the year Simpson visited. This is a communist rising up, of uprising at the moment, as you might see. And it was all over the place, in France and other countries. And this is the guy you know well, Charles Darwin, the destroyer of myths, as one book notes it. And he wrote about the origin of species. And as you might see on the picture, you see an ape developing into a human being. But there was also the uprising and the upcoming of textual criticism of the Bible, which really influenced a lot of churches at the time. And Simpson, when he went to Europe, actually asked himself the question if they were still believing or not, especially because of these influences. There's another book about the rise of empires, good book to read if you want to know more about this time. Have a look at Africa. There was a race for Africa, as you might see. In 1880, all small parts and some imperial powers connected to Africa. But if you look at 1913, the maps were drawn anew. And on such a scale, you can't even imagine today. I want to read a text with you, which was really monumental for Simpson. And it comes from the Old Testament in 1 Chronicles 12. And there's a list of the warriors of David. So that's why I start in verse 1. But I want to connect to verse 32, especially. Let's start in verse 1. These were the men who came to David at Ziklag. While he was banished from the presence of Saul, son of Kish, they were among the warriors who helped him in battle. And after that, you get a whole list of people who helped in battle, but selected by tribe. And then comes the tribe of Issachar. And in verse 32, this is what's said about them. From Issachar, men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. 200 chiefs with all their relatives under their command. This verse really plays a big role in the upcoming evangelical movement, wanting to read the times, especially because of their eschatology. As I told, I think with Simpson's life and his biography, the Civil War in the US had a major impact. Before the Civil War, eschatology was really dreaming about a better future, and they saw the world develop. But after the Civil War, which really meant that there was a divide in families, a divide in churches, a divide along all kinds of lines, it was a really cold awakening to see what people could do, like the old continent would have with the First World War. and they saw brother killing brother, and it was really what's happening. And they asked themselves questions concerning eschatology, and it was really the uprising of the evangelical eschatology, looking at the end times as we do in evangelical circles a lot. And Simpson did as well, that Christ is coming King. They expected the soon arrival of Christ um, in their midst and on earth. And they were working together to reach the world, to speed up the coming of Christ. And with it came a reading of the times, as they are saying from Issachar here. They were looking at the times, and there were whole scale events. The maps were drawing anew. There were uprisings, there were wars. They thought Christ was coming soon. And in these times, Simpson read his times. And he took this verse at heart. And he thought about what he should do. In Europe, he writes letters to Maggie. It's an interesting chapter in the biography of Dave Jones. And in these letters, you get to see his private life, the choices he made, but also very funny things. Writing to the children, but also having a quarrel with a German conductor at a train, and all kinds of things. But they give a very interesting view of the person of AB and the relationship he had with his dear wife and children, but also funny quotes, as I said, on where things went wrong, missing a train, seasick people, and more. But it also shows how Simpson read his times and his eagerness to learn, openness to what he sees, and a very striking ability to see the challenges and reflect on that. But also his ability in seeing gospel access in it and to adapt ministry accordingly. He really understood what he should do. For instance, on the funny side of things, he went on to climb the bell tower in Firenze, Florence. And he had a weak health, as you might remember, and he was stuck in the middle of climbing the stairs and went back. He didn't write to Maggie about that because she was really concerned about his health. So there were some things he wrote about, and there were some things he didn't write about. One thing he did write about was when he visited Venice, and he was on San Marco Square. And he was approached by a young girl in white robes, and he really thought it was nice, but it turned out to be a prostitute, and he was really turned upside down. The minister, the nice person wanting to be nice, was really shocked to see all these prostitutes on the San Marco Square. And yeah, I can imagine if you grow up as a neat boy inside of a church situation, inside of a churchy house, and you hear all kinds of good stories about Europe, the old countries where the Reformation started. This is really a shrewd waking up. And there are more things which really shock him. To see faith at such a low level in the countries where the Reformation started, Germany, but also in France, in Belgium. And he sees the uprising, the things we saw on the photo. It really shocked him. And he instantly knows that this and all these other things he sees are coming to the shores of the New World as well. This is not to stay in Europe, because America was also rising up as an empire at the moment. We'll see about that in the next few slides. But still, he was still connected to the dream God gave him, and he wanted to reach the world, and it took shape at that moment. And it's a good thing to read it again. Revelation 7. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes, and were holding palm branches in their hands. And Simpson, when he went back to the New World, really took the lessons he learned and the things he saw and thought about how he could minister to these peoples, because God wants to reach them. God wants people from every color, tribe, and nation gathered around the throne of the Messiah. So he actually adapts to that, and he writes essays, and he preaches about the things to come. But he's also very, very busy with gospel access in through the lens of understanding the times on behalf of what he might see. And what are kairotic moments? So he looks at the race for Africa. The first missionaries were actually sent to Congo, but at a moment when they could be sent there. Uh, the whole mission went wrong, but the country was slightly opening up. Before that, all these big imperial empires really thought about themselves and their own state church, and they really stopped evangelical missionary movement at the front gate. They didn't want other countries to intermingle in their affairs, so they stopped. And Simpson recognized when borders went open and sent missionaries to countries who were slightly opening. So he read the news not only in light of the coming of Christ, but also as an opportunity to send people to these countries. He really wanted to know what his world was about, to connect the gospel to it. And that's a rare commodity. It's a rare gift, I might say. But what he didn't see is that the race for Africa was mainly about these empires getting richer and richer, and making use of the raw materials and all these things. But Simpson had a really dreamy view of the world. He thought of Livingstone coming into British Africa and spreading the word, the gospel. And sure, there was a lot of good thing. There were a lot of good things happening, and there were a lot of people evangelized. But with imperialization, we took our ways of church as well to these peoples. Maybe something for another time, but that's what happened. So it's been really difficult because the spreading of the gospel went hand in hand with imperialism, and that's a challenge even for us today. Is it about us, or is it about Christ and what he wants to do in the world he wants to reach and the peoples he wants to reach? Do they need to dress like we dress? Do they need to sing like we sing? Build a church like we build a church? I think these are still interesting questions to ask, also for a time of today. But there's more. During the turn of the century, the Spanish Empire collapsed, and the US smelled blood and declared war on them. And the Spanish went away from most of their colonies, like the Philippines, but also Cuba. And the US set foot on these lands. And as a result, the closed lands, which they were within the Spanish Empire, were opening up for the gospel and for missionaries. And the first thing they did was sending missionaries to these areas. So, gospel access at kairotic moments. It's the same in the Middle East. This is a photo of, how do you call it? A Sunday school, which it came to be in Syria. And George Braden, the pioneer missionary, was sent there. But before that, Simpson sent women to evangelize in the Holy Land, but also in Jordan and in Syria, because there was a really a masculine culture, and it was really closed, but he thought of what could be openings, and he sent women to guide these small children and to learn them how to write and to sing. So there was an opening for the gospel, and after that he sent more missionaries and churches were built. So always looking for gospel access. This is another one, as you might see, and I made the photo big. um, this is actually coming from the CNMA in Canada. And as you might see, this is China, but the map is slightly different, as you might know China today. China was as in turmoil as well. We only know it as a communist country, but in the 100 years before it became a communist country, there were takeovers of power. The Japanese had influence. Um, the empires were looking for a place in China. Even the Germans held a small portion of China, Tsingtao province, and that's where they produced the famous Tsingtao beer. It's actually German beer, Owen, but made by the Chinese, and it's the Chinese national brand for beer. But back to missions and gospel access. Look how they read the times. God's command, go. China's call. Population, they did their homework. Christians, they did their homework. Death rate as well. And there's more to say, but they sought for gospel access and they read the times, as you might see. And there was also gospel access at home. We've talked about Simpson looking at a city through the lens of Acts 1, verse 8. And he saw the immigration and the immigrants coming into the country as people with no home, possibly the Samaritans, people to reach, neglected peoples to reach out to. But also, he was not alone in this challenge. This is a photo of Walter Rauschenbusch, as you might know. And Rauschenbusch is known for the social gospel. Churches were busy and thinking through how to connect with their world again. And this was one of the options. But the social gospel was not the option for Simpson, because he wondered um, what proclamation is into that social gospel. Is Christ still proclaimed in a sense that they need to turn and accept Christ as a savior? But at the same time, he organized rescue missions and a baraja home where people, the sick and poor, could get healed and find a home. So he uses the things which are already there and looks for a gospel entry point. That's what he does at home and far away. And I think it's a hallmark feature for the CNMA worldwide. And I think it's a DNA feature as well. Always be creative and on the lookout how we can connect gospel access to the situation which is at hand. But the reading of the times also brings challenges. Because when he said this, a church that wants the poor, misses them, seeks them, will always find them, feed them, and will be filled with them. He was at a crisis moment because he thought he talked through about reaching the city for Christ. That was the reason he came to New York City, and to connect with the wider world, to send missionaries out into the world. But the church board didn't want the people he reached for Christ. The 100 immigrants he wanted to baptize and put forward as for membership were rejected, and it broke Simpson's heart. And from that came a challenge: what to do? And he resigned. And this is 13th Street Presbyterian Church now. It's actually a housing block. But Simpson didn't know when he chose to leave that church that he would start a movement. The only thing he had was a vision and a longing to see more of God, and God reaching out to all peoples of all kinds, and to be a church for all peoples. And look what the results are. You're on the photo as well, Marco. From left to right, it's Amer from Jordan. Top row, Yao Serge from Côte d'Ivoire. Jim Rudd from the US. Me, Marco, and Peter Laughlin, Australia. Bernie van der Wallen with Belgian ancestry, Canadian. Second row, Onesimo Feliz, Dominican Republic. Chris from Canada. Jura, our president, a Brazilian with Japanese ancestry. Chris, he serves in Uruguay, but he's from Chile. And David Paxol from Indonesia, a worldwide family. But sure, it does bring challenges in the kairotic moments and in the crises where we are sometimes. There needs to be a longing to serve God and to make difficult choices sometimes, if you read the times. But there's more. Simpson also chooses sides in a bitter conflict when the First World War was on the rise. He really saw the Germans as the aggressor, and he talked about it, he wrote about it, but it brought challenges in the movement he served, because there were a lot of people with German ancestry really asking questions. Is this really what you want to say? Is this really what you want to communicate? Is Germany really the aggressor in this bitter conflict? Look at this. The First World War was an awakening for Europe, that it was not a belle époque. It was not going better all the time. The Industrial Revolution didn't bring nice things only. No, there were weapons developed, like gas and other things, and were experimentally used on the battlefield. And look at the woods above the trenches. The horrors of the First World War really started Europe asking questions. Where is God in this? How does it work? One famous person was Karl Barth. He really turned from his evolutionary belief system, in which he thought it could only get better. But still, Simpson had Matthew 24:14 during the First World War as one of his guidelines. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So he kept on sending missionaries to all fields, because only the preaching of the gospel to all nations will bring back the king. But sometimes he was also wrong, and especially in 1917, this is the photo of General George Allenby taking Jerusalem, and he took it by foot because he wanted to show mercy and his good intentions for the city. But Simpson read about it in the newspaper and was uplifted. He thought the end was near and Christ was coming soon. He thought Jerusalem will be the place where Christ is going to return, and these are the signs of his coming now. He didn't know what kind of conflict would resume in the next coming years, and the bitterness of that. But he did send missionaries. The Jew first was always proclaimed. First the Jew, then the Greek. And they sent missionaries to the land of the Holy One. And they actually built a church in the old city. the Tin Tabernacle, as it was known. And we do have a thriving church now in Palestine. And I'm really uplifted by that, to be part of such a movement. But to read our times. In the Guayaquil Manifesto are some points to share and to think through. There is rapid change at the moment. There's diaspora taking place, unprecedented migration flow. Structures are under pressure, social and political, just like in the time of Simpson. The change in the world's power epicenter is taking place now. Worldview, the effects of postmodernism, but there's way more. Influence of secular worldviews within the church, changes to sexuality and gender norms, the embracing of pluralism and growing hostility to the uniqueness of the gospel. This is our world. What do you think about justice? The inequality of the world's systems, the debasing of human life, global poverty, pandemics, abuse, trafficking, misogyny, and any and all oppression due to race, class, gender, and social status. We've seen it all. Emerging generations. And it starts with ministry here, but there's really a big divide between generations. How can we abridge them? Resources. There's a decline of all kinds of resources. Vision. The change of the point of gravity of Christianity from the north, North America, Europe, etc., to the south, Latin America, Asia, Africa, countries we used to send missionaries to. This is the place where the church is thriving. And how can we be a part of that? And how can we connect with peoples in our countries, coming from these countries, and seeing them as sent to us as a gift God gives in these times? Now, what they've said is, therefore, the challenge is immense in its scope, complex in its meaning, and demands that we return to the driving principles of missionary action, deeper life, and missions. I have some questions to discuss for the breakout groups. And the questions are, what are our specific challenges at the moment in our given context? And it could be different in the Middle East and in Europe. It could be different per country. It could be different per region, a province, even a city. 2, can these challenges become gospel access? And how can we work together to fulfill God's call to mission?